Hello, and welcome to week number 3 of Intro to Theater Online. As always, am your professor, Andrew Friedman. I hope that you're all doing well and enjoying the course so far. I know that I've enjoyed reading your discussion posts and your assignments up to this point. Just a brief recap. What we've done so far in the first 2 weeks is look at the question of performance. How performance operates in our daily lives, how performance operates in the larger world, and more specifically, how performance operates in the theater. For this week, we're going to change direction slightly and become a little more specific. For this week, you'll be reading chapters 2 on the text and chapter 5 on the playwright. And as we'll see, these two things are interconnected. One thing to keep in mind about chapter 2 that discusses the text is that, like performance, which we discussed earlier, text is a large category. It is a large category that can include lots of different things. I'm sure you can think of many different types of texts. We have texts that are what we might expect a text to be, like a novel, for instance. This is what I'm reading right now. Or you can have a text like a set of instructions on how to achieve something. You can have a text which is anything that documents something else, right? So this would include an encyclopedia, this would include a letter to one of your friends or a diary. There are many different types of texts. It's a large category, just like the category of performance, right? And just like in the category of performance, theater is a very specific thing. Within the category of text, plays or drama is also a very specific thing. It has specific qualities and characteristics. So one of the things I'd like you to keep in mind and think about moving forward throughout the course is that what is specific to drama or plays that it does not share with, say, a novel or other types of texts. And one thing I'd like to point out now is that a play or a drama is almost always, there are a few exceptions, almost always written to be performed. And that has a very important consequence or effect for our thinking about a play or a drama. And that consequence is that what a play ultimately is a blueprint for something else, right? So, for example, when we order our bed or our dresser from IKEA, right, it comes with a text, and this text is a set of instructions that, depending on your experience with putting IKEA furniture together, may be quite simple or quite difficult, right? But in fact, that text is not the bed that you can sleep on, right? It is a blueprint to make the thing. And this is also what plays are. They are blueprints to make a thing. And one of the challenges in reading plays is that we are responsible as readers to imagine what this might look like as a production, right? So when you pick up a play and read it, it is not ultimately just a dialogue between a couple of characters. It is a blueprint to create an entire world. And one of the big challenges in reading plays is that, unlike the IKEA bed, right, which once you follow that blueprint and build the bed, you can look at the bed and say, here's the bed, does it look like the blueprint? In the world of theater, we make the production using the blueprint of the play, but once that production is over, it disappears, right? Everybody goes home, the actors take off their costumes, the set comes down, the lights get turned off, and suddenly that thing that we created from the blueprint disappears. So it makes it very hard to have an example of that blueprint in action to compare it to. right? And of course, there are plays that are made for TV, there are plays that are filmed or photographed, but all of those things are not the actual production, right? They are a copy of the production. And this is one of the big challenges that I think everybody experiences when they read a play, is that it is difficult to imagine this whole world. And sometimes playwrights will detail that world with stage directions or information about characters or other types of details in the text to help us fill out the world. And then there are other playwrights that give us none of that. They give us maybe a little bit of information about a character, like a name, and then the dialogue. And one of the things that the other artists in the theater do is they realize that vision. So that's something to keep in mind, is that text is very broad and drama or plays are very specific. And one of the big challenges in reading plays is that they are incomplete, right? Which is quite different than, say, again, a novel. This is how this book is to be experienced. It contains everything you need to experience it. It is self-contained. And that is not necessarily the case with dramatic texts. So, in terms of chapter 5, in thinking about the playwright. Now, as I'm sure you well know, the playwright is the person who writes the play. And this job in the theater is as old as, of course, dramatic literature. But one of the things to keep in mind when reading this chapter, and I think one of the things that this chapter does fairly well, is show us that there are many, many different types of playwrights and different types of playwriting. There is, for example, the vision of the playwright that some of us may have, which is that someone goes off in a room somewhere and sits down with a typewriter and types up a play and then hands it over to a bunch of actors. And that is one model of playwriting that exists. But there are other versions of playwriting that we might call devised playwriting or devised work, in which a playwright may work with other collaborators. They may work with the performers in the show. They may work directly with the director of the show or something called a dramaturg. And these people will help contribute ideas, text, and may even write some of the material alongside the playwright. And that is to say, playwriting is as varied and different as any other art form, right? And perhaps painting is the easiest way to see this. If you go to a museum of modern art, right, or any museum for that matter, you may not know the names of all the painters, but you can tell the difference between standing in front of a painting by Picasso and a painting by Jackson Pollock, right? They have distinctly different styles and approaches to painting. And this is also true of playwrights. Some playwrights write texts that are seemingly very realistic. The speech patterns and characters represented in the play might seem very much like people you might meet in your own day-to-day life. There are playwrights that are not interested in that at all. There are playwrights that create entirely fantastical worlds, and there are playwrights that construct the language and the plots of their dramas using what might be called verbatim text, which means these are things that people have actually said, right? So they actually take real things from the world and use that as the material for the text. So all that is to say is that styles of playwriting are as varied as any other art form. And this is one of the things that creates the great diversity of plays in the world, is this kind of variety. One other thing to keep in mind in reading about playwrights is that while playwriting is quite diverse and varied, one of the most lasting influences on thinking about playwriting, right? What constitutes a good play? What is a successful play? Is something called Aristotle's Poetics, which you'll be reading about in this chapter. And Aristotle was an ancient Greek philosopher, biologist, but also wrote the most influential piece of criticism about playwriting. And in that, it's called the Poetics, Aristotle lays out 6 components to the creation of what he understands to be a successful tragedy, right? So there are a couple things that are worth keeping in mind. Now, while these principles have been very influential throughout theater history and stick around with us today, when Aristotle was writing these poetics, these 6 rules, he basically had one play in mind. There's one play in mind, and that was Oedipus Rex. And he created these rules based on what he saw as the expertise or the success of that one play. And it's important to keep this in mind because it is very tempting, I think, for everybody, especially when you're encountering something new, if this art form of theater is new to you, is to grab onto those rules and say, aha, I get it. This is a good play or a bad play because it adheres to the unity of action, which is one of the things you'll read about in Aristotle. But it's equally important to keep in mind that the history of all art forms, not just theater, all art forms, is one in which artists oftentimes look at what has been established in the past, whether those are rules written down by someone like Aristotle or just conventions, that is to say, standardized ways of doing things that develop over time. And one of the things artists like to do is change them or challenge them, right? So while we read Aristotle's Poetics, and while he gives us a lovely blueprint for what an effective Greek tragedy might be, it is also important to keep in mind that something like the plays of Shakespeare adhere to almost none of those rules, right? And this is again where we get this great variety of dramatic texts. Oftentimes artists look to the past for inspiration, but at the same time they say, that was really great. That's a great job you did on that play. But this part doesn't make sense to us today. Or this part I think can be improved. Or this part needs to be changed. So when you encounter these rules and conventions, remember that they are not hard and fast, right? And that each generation has to reconfigure and rethink what is valuable about the art form to them. So those are a couple of things to keep in mind for this week's readings. And one final thing that I should point out that comes up in the section on playwrights is that it also talks a little bit about different types of plays, and this they refer to as the genre of play. And of course, we'll hear about tragedy and comedy, but also forms like melodrama, which is defined simply as music drama. And because of this earlier issue that we encounter with dramatic texts, which is that they are incomplete, they are a blueprint for something else, it's oftentimes hard to distinguish one genre of a play versus another genre of a play before we learn all the conventions of that, right? And we know, basically, one of the most overriding conventions of the genres of tragedy and comedy is that a tragedy ends poorly, correct? It is tragic in its end, and a comedy is usually resolved happily. And we can see this quite easily in film. Again, film is a place that we are all probably fairly conversant and familiar with different genres. We could watch any movie for 5 minutes and you could tell me whether it was a comedy or a horror movie or an action movie or a drama. But this is a little more difficult when it comes to reading plays because, again, they are incomplete. So one of the things to consider about the genre of melodrama that comes up is that melodrama is distinct from both comedy and tragedy because it has a few distinct aims that are with us still today. So oftentimes melodrama is a type of drama that starts in the 18th century and, as we'll see, continues with us today, that has very clear divisions between what we might say as good and evil people. And these divisions are made clear through very overt distinctions between those people. So, for example, we get different characters having very easily discernible costuming, musical underscoring, behaviors, and types of language that tell us what type of person they are. Is this person a villain? Is this person a hero? Is this person a sympathetic character? Is this person a comic character? And one of the perhaps clearest examples of this today is something like Star Wars, right? So for instance, if I asked you all, and you could respond right now to this video, who is the villain of Star Wars, you would be able to immediately tell me that it is Darth Vader. And your ability to tell me that immediately is because there are a number of things that the movie does consistently to tell you he is the villain. He is dressed in all black. He has a weird, menacing voice. He has weird, menacing music that comes up every time he's on the screen. Actually, that music starts before he even gets on the screen to tell you the villain is coming. We know he is the villain because he does mean things to good people. And we could also do the reverse for who is the hero, right? We could see that this is Luke Skywalker, and the same things come up. While Darth Vader is all in black, Luke Skywalker is all in white, right? Luke Skywalker's music is nice with flutes. It is not menacing. It is perhaps uplifting and encouraging compared to Darth Vader's menacing music. We could also extend this to think about other types of characters in the movie. For instance, comic characters like C-3PO, who has a somewhat comic voice and a weird way of walking and a weird type of music that underscores his behavior too. And in fact, he has a comic sidekick with R2-D2, right? They work as a comic pair. Now, all of these conventions that we see in something like Star Wars and perhaps in many, many movies, including things on television like soap operas or even sitcoms where we get conventional types of characters, right, is that these things all originate from the melodrama. The melodrama being something that had very distinct character types or archetypal characters or stereotypical characters. And those stereotypes and archetypes are underscored by every aspect of the theater, right? The costuming, the language, the musical underscoring, and the performance behavior. So, for example, in melodrama, every villain in most of the popular melodramas of the 18th and 19th centuries had long black mustaches, right? So when you came and sat in the theater, all you had to do is look for that one thing and you automatically knew who was the villain in the play, right? The terms are quite clear in that type of world. One other thing that is quite impressive about melodrama that sticks with us till this very day is the fact that the melodrama also used something called spectacle or sensation scenes. And these were huge scenes that would take place on stage that were designed to be awe-inspiring. And in fact, they really were. There were many melodrama theaters that had giant tanks of water that they would race horses into. They would burn down buildings on stage. They would attempt to create volcanoes exploding or earthquakes. In fact, one of the most famous melodramas of the 19th century included a scene where one of the good characters was tied to a set of train tracks by a villain with a big black mustache, and they had the two first cars of a train drive on tracks across the stage towards this person who is, of course, rescued just in the nick of time. Um, so the melodrama had quite clear divisions between good and evil. It used all of the resources of the theater to show this, and of course, good triumphs over evil in these stories. But it also employed sensation scenes or giant pieces of spectacle. And we might think about this again as a precursor to the Hollywood blockbuster movie, right? I You can think of just about any one that you've seen, but any blockbuster movie these days has some extraordinary scene of action and suspense with some sort of dazzling special effects that is showing something that seems quite impossible. So anyway, that's just one genre that you may not be entirely familiar with, but will be brought up in the text. So again, please read those chapters. Please also look ahead to week number 4 and think about the playwriting assignment that is coming up in that week. It's a little bit larger, so you want to think ahead for that. But until next week, I hope that you are all doing well. And as always, if you have questions, concerns, if you're confused, or if you're having problems, please contact me. My email is available on the Blackboard page. So until next week, see you later.